If you have a scary story you'd like to hear on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. I'd love to feature it. And of course, thank you. When I was a kid, and through pretty much all of my time growing up, I used to live near a military base. My dad was in the military, and he was important, I guess. I honestly have not the slightest idea what it was that he did, but he was pretty much never home, and I had practically no relationship with him up to when he died of cancer. My dad isn't the important part of this, but I think the military base may be. I can't prove that this thing had anything to do with the military, but would it really surprise anyone if they were doing some sort of experiment on humans and mixing them with animals? I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, and I should probably go through the entire event that happened before I say that. I'm not going to say when exactly this was, nor where, but I will say that I was in my early teens, probably 13 at most. We were living in our small 2-bedroom house near the base, and really, there was nothing special about it, other than it had a basement that could have doubled as a bomb shelter. The night that this happened, I was in my bed and struggling to sleep. I remember vividly that I was having a lot of problems sleeping around this time because I was feeling like something was watching me in my room. I wasn't a paranoid kid, but for a few nights, I was feeling like I was paranoid. Like I was having major anxiety, but I didn't know why. It didn't happen for very long, but it was something that I was dealing with for a couple of days prior to the actual event. On the actual night where I saw this thing, I was still having trouble sleeping, and I had pretty much given up on sleeping, so I was sitting on my bed and reading something. While I was reading, I started hearing what sounded like raspy and deep breathing, like someone was struggling to get enough air. It's a hard sound to explain beyond deep gasping. This sound wasn't coming from my room. It was definitely coming from outside. But it was loud enough that I could very clearly hear what it was. I went over to my window to see what it was, but at first, I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness of the night. I kept focusing, trying to adjust my eyes to the night, and it was then that I saw the thing that was struggling to breathe. It was a man, or what looked like a man, but he was covered with what looked like mangy fur. It almost looked like he should have been covered in fur, but someone took an electric razor and shaved about 75% of the hair off of him. I couldn't see him at first because he was struggling to stand up from under my window. He was basically sitting there and crawling away while trying to pull himself up to his feet. It was at this point that I realized that the sound of the gasping was definitely outlined in pain. This human-like thing was definitely suffering, struggling to breathe, and I had to assume that it was dying. And it made me think that I needed to do something about it. Because I was still a kid, I decided that I needed to tell my mom. I went in and woke her up, telling her that there was a man outside my window that was choking. That was the only way I could think to explain it. She told me to stay in her room and not come out until she came back, and she walked out. I could hear her on the phone, and I heard her say my dad's name, and then tell whoever she was talking to which unit we were in. I wasn't sure who she was talking to, but I assumed it was the police. After a few moments of waiting and listening to her talking, I actually left her room and went back to mine because I was genuinely curious what exactly was going on. I remember hearing my mom and then my dad talking, though they were talking in hushed tones, and I couldn't quite make out what they were actually saying. I could still hear the gasping, the choking sound that this humanoid thing was making, but it was quickly cut out by the sound of a large truck pulling up into our yard, and what sounded like other military men shouting that they were there to help him. As they approached, I started hearing the gasping getting louder and faster, almost like this thing was scared of the people approaching him. As soon as I started hearing this, I heard my mom and dad talking again and getting louder, which meant that they were coming upstairs. So I ran out of my room and into the hallway. My mom was obviously mad at me for leaving her room, but I just told her that I had to go to the bathroom and she left it alone. I asked them what that was all about, and my dad just told me that it was a homeless man that was very sick and that they were taking him to the hospital. The fact that my dad was home told me that this was more serious than just a sick homeless man, but I wasn't going to poke him and ask for more. That was the only time that anything like that happened, and my dad never told me any more information, nor has my mother. I don't know what that thing was, but it wasn't quite human, or if it was human, it was not fully human. I saw this thing. Something was sincerely wrong with it, or him, or whatever. I don't know if this would really qualify as a cryptid really, but to me, it was a creature that was unexplainable, which fits technically. Whatever it was, the military took care of it, and that was that. I have family members that live in the middle of nowhere, way outside of any major town or anything, and of course, they are the family that I tend to go and see during the holidays. Thanksgiving is one of the major holidays for my family, as it was my grandmother's favorite day, and we would get all the extended family on her side together to have a lovely meal, and it's always a good time. This story isn't about the get-together, though. It's about something that happened after the fact. Most years, I would stay at my aunt's house and leave early the next morning, but on the year that this happened, I was working for a company that was doing a merger with another organization, so they had pretty much limited time off to only the specific holiday, and because of this, I had to get home that night so that I could get up at 6 a.m. and get to the office early the next day. If nothing else, it was a pain in my ass, as I hate driving late at night, especially for the full hour I have to drive to the north to get home, and the fact that they live in the middle of nowhere means that there are absolutely no streetlights. I tried to leave at a good time, but it was hard to leave my family that night, as they wanted to continue talking and spending time together. So by the time I got out of there, it was around 10:30 at night. I get out of the driveway and out onto the dark roads, making the necessary curves, trying to keep my eyes open and my mind focused on the trip. I was definitely struggling, like really struggling to keep myself awake. I think that digesting all that food and the hard spike in my blood sugar had really started taking its toll on me. I could feel my eyelids starting to drop as I was going. The longer I went, the harder it was to keep myself going. So I figured that the best course of action for me was to put on some music. Unfortunately, I have an older car that doesn't have any sort of wireless connectivity, so when I listen to music, it has to be on CD. The disc that I had in was not going to be enough to keep me awake. I needed something heavy and aggressive. So I ejected the CD, and slowed down a bit so I could reach down onto my floor to grab my CD folder. I will say that this was incredibly stupid. I was taking my eyes off the road and focusing on reaching down to grab my CD holder. Like I said, stupid, but it's what I did. I reached down, grabbed my folder, and grabbed a disc for some metal band, and when I looked back up on the road, I noticed a figure standing there in the middle of the road. I panicked and I slammed my brakes to do my best to avoid hitting whatever or whoever this was. Thankfully, despite the car being old, it did have a good braking system, and I was able to stop pretty quickly without flipping my car or driving into the trees on the shoulder. When I came to the screeching halt, I was gripping the wheel and just trying to breathe through my excruciatingly painful heartbeat that was pulsing in my head. I honestly thought I was about to have a heart attack, considering how high my blood pressure was over those couple seconds. After a few moments of taking deep breaths and just staring at my dashboard, I finally was able to get my mind back to reality, and then realized that I needed to make sure I actually didn't hit whatever that was. I looked up and out of the windows and in the mirrors, trying to see if I could see anything, but there was nothing there. I was confused, panicked, and trying not to literally pass out. Where the hell had this thing gone? What the hell was that thing? I pulled the car over to the side of the road and parked it so that I could get out and look around to see what was going on. I stepped out onto the road and walked a bit back, looking into the shadows of the road that was lit only by my taillights. I stared at the darkness, squinted to see if there was anything there, when I did see something. In the darkness, I could see what looked to be that same figure, still mostly shapeless, but almost human-shaped, just standing in the darkness and looking in my direction. I lifted my hand and waved and shouted back to see if this was a person and if they were okay. I shouted, "Hey, is everything all right?" And as I did, this figure just stood there, motionless. I was starting to get freaked out, thinking that this wasn't a person, that it was something else, something supernatural. I started to walk backwards towards my car, keeping my eyes on this figure, and as I got to my car and reached toward my handle, I heard what sounded like laughing, like a high-pitched voice was giggling in the distance, in the direction of whatever this thing was. That was all I needed to hear. I threw my door open, got in, and I took back off down the road to continue my trip. I drove the rest of the way in silence, my heart keeping up its stupid fast rate, staring in my rearview mirror every 10 seconds to see if this thing was following me somehow. Obviously it wasn't, whatever the hell that demonic thing was. It stayed there in the dark, a fact for which I was very thankful. I got home and I struggled to go to sleep that night, just kind of staring at the ceiling with my heart just pounding like hell. Honestly, I don't think my BPM dropped below 120 until the next morning. Like my body was reacting intensely to the whole thing, like my instincts knew that whatever this was truly dangerous, and it would have been much worse if I hadn't taken off. To this day, I still can't explain what happened on that drive home. I've tried to rationalize it as my imagination running wild or some sort of prank, but deep down, I know that something truly terrifying was watching me. I've since avoided that stretch of road. I've found another way to get home from my aunt's house, and the memory of that night still haunts me. For anyone that has any sort of name for this thing or an explanation, please do let me know. I can't physically describe it other than it seemed to just be a living shadow on the road that stared intently. It looked like a person, sort of, but it was mostly shapeless beyond that. It was just intensely dark and creepy. I know that this doesn't help much, but it's the best I've got for it. Anyways, that's my story, and I hope that I never experience anything like this for the rest of my days. There was a time in my life when things were really bad. Like, I was homeless and living as a vagabond, getting food from trash cans and begging people for change, kind of bad. This was a long time ago, and I'm doing a lot better in my life now, but this point in my life was really low. And while some people may say that I was hallucinating or just seeing things, I wasn't a stereotypical homeless person. I didn't do any sort of drugs. I didn't drink. I just struggled to get through every day, and what led to me being homeless was out of my control. I'm not going to get into all of that because it's not really important, but I will say that I was basically living in a rust bucket with 4 wheels that barely ran. Back when this happened, most cities weren't really bothered by people sleeping in their cars like they are today. And so long as you were out of the way and not bothering anyone, you could pretty much just stay where you were for the night and no one would care. Back then, because I was sleeping in my car, I typically tried to park it somewhere that was away from people and wouldn't be an issue for anyone. There was one spot that I liked specifically that was in a small suburban area that was only sort of incorporated. It was mostly residential, and there were woods that pretty much surrounded the streets, like there were a good number of houses, but if you kept going, there was an area that was just a road with trees on both sides. I would go toward that area that didn't have the houses, and I would pull over and park on the side of the road as close to the trees as I could, and that's where I would essentially camp out. It almost felt like actually camping, to be honest with you, because it was surrounded by the trees and I was safe in my little car, so I try to hold on to that optimism and make the most out of it. That is, until the event this story is about happened. I had been camping there for a couple of weeks, just thankful that I had a bit of stability in my depressing circumstance. On that night, I had actually managed to get a few dollars together, so I had gotten a Big Mac from McDonald's and a small soda. So I was honestly happy as could be. It was around 9 at night, and I was sitting there savoring my meal when I noticed what looked like a deer in a small clearing in the woods. I'd seen a few deers in the area before, so it wasn't really surprising, but I also liked deer, so I was thinking that this was going to be even better of a night. When you're in a bad situation, the simple things mean a lot, honestly. As the deer started walking through the woods and getting closer to where I was, I started to see that there was something wrong with it. At first, I thought it had some sort of parasite or something. I'd read about those kind of things, but I quickly realized that it wasn't a parasite. Whatever was wrong with this thing was really wrong. As it got closer, I was able to see that it looked like the skin was actually falling off its face. Like I could see part of its jawbone from where its flesh was near literally melting off its face. It took me a minute to realize what the hell I was seeing. I was trying to mentally piece together that maybe it had been attacked and was dying, but no. The skin wasn't just falling off like it had been ripped into. It was melting. And it wasn't just its face. It was all over its head, legs, and midsection. Its antlers were sharp pointed and were also broken and looked like they had some kind of skin hanging off of them. I was thinking that if this was a deer, it was really messed up from something. But after a few moments, I came to be certain that it was not a deer. As it stepped through the woods, this thing got toward a tree and slowly pulled itself up onto its hind legs and started scratching at the tree with its hooves. Though they weren't really hooves, they looked more like claws. This zombified deer monster thing was standing there, its flesh falling off the bone and clawing at the base of a tree for God knows what reason. I genuinely have no idea what this thing was, but I immediately started my car and drove off. I was not going to deal with whatever the hell this monster was. I had nothing to protect myself or to fight this monster with if it decided it wanted to come and get me. And I was not going to die by some melting deer monster. I wish I had a camera with me at the time, or that this was when camera phones were a common thing, because I cannot properly explain how disgustingly terrifying this thing really was. And if I had a picture of it, then maybe I could get someone out there to hunt it and kill it, because this thing was not natural. If it was a deer, then the only word I can think to describe it is zombified. And the fact that its hooves looked more like claws to me tells me that this thing was something else altogether. Obviously, I never went back to that area ever. I never camped out there again, and I pretty much kept to parking lots when I was still sleeping in my car. I thankfully did get through this hard time, and things are better now, but I will never forget that night I saw this horrifying beast, and I'm just glad I've never seen anything like it again. I used to spend a lot of my summer vacation at my grandparents' house, which was essentially a small farm in the middle of nowhere. And as much as I loved my grandparents, I used to also get really bored. I used to go out and explore some of their land and would oftentimes go out into the forest that lined their property, despite the fact that my grandma would tell me that I needed to stay close to the house. One year, I had ventured out and found what was basically a small cave near the property line, and I loved it. It was a really small cave, like large enough for me to fit comfortably in when I was about 10, and that was about it. It was large enough for an adult to crawl into, but it was rather cramped and it wouldn't be comfortable for anyone larger than a child to stay in for more than a few minutes. I had actually painted part of one of the walls with my name and some random things, just to mark it as mine, basically. It was dumb, but it was my little home away from my grandparents' farmhouse. As I got into my older teen years, I stopped going to my grandparents' house as frequently, mostly because my parents were more okay with me staying home alone. I hadn't gone to the farmhouse for a few years by the time this all happened, as a matter of fact. About a decade ago, my grandfather passed away, so I actually spent several days with my grandmother at the house to keep her company and make sure she was doing okay. On one of the days while I was staying with her, I wanted to walk the property, and after a little while, I remembered my little cave, and I wanted to go see if it was still there or if it had been taken over by nature. I head out to the northern corner of the land, jump the fence, and head out into the woods toward where the cave was. After a few moments of fumbling with the location, I actually found where the opening was and was excited that it was still there. The next part was the difficult part, which was me trying to figure out if I could get into the cave at all without getting stuck. After thinking it through, I decided that I could pretty much get half my body in if I turned the right way, and from there, I would be able to see if my name was still painted on the wall. I get down and start to twist myself in, and as soon as I get my head into the cave, I start to smell something putrid. It was pretty obvious that something had died there, which was disappointing, but I just assumed it would be a possum or a raccoon or something that had scurried away to die in the cave. It was gross, but it wasn't going to stop me from seeing if this was still my cave. I get my head in, and what I saw was horrifying. It wasn't just a small dead animal. It was numerous dead animals, like dozens of carcasses were lined up on the back wall. There was also what looked like children's clothing piled off to the side, and what looked like an old doll sitting on top of the clothes. At this point, I was out. I pushed myself out of the cave, not even caring if it was still marked, because something was staying in this cave, and I didn't want to know what the hell it was. As most scary stories go, though, it didn't just end with dead bodies in the cave. As soon as I pushed myself out, I started hearing what sounded like growling or hissing. I stood up and looked around, but didn't see whatever it was that was so angry with me until I looked up. I have no idea what the hell the thing was that was about 200 feet away from me, standing in one of the trees and angrily growling at me. It looked human-like, but it was 100% not human. I took off thinking that this creature was going to chase me, but about halfway to the fence, I looked back and saw this thing actually crawling on the ground toward the cave, which made this all worse. This thing was whatever was living there and storing its spare carcasses there. I just kept running toward the house and decided that I would forget this thing ever existed. I never mentioned it to my grandma, and unfortunately, she passed away that same year and the estate was sold. So I have no way of going back to see if that thing was still there. And I never got the chance to go back with a camera or anything. I really do not know what I saw, but it looked like some kind of feral human-like monster, but it wasn't large. It was almost childlike. It was small enough to live in that cave. It was nimble enough to climb and stand in a tree as it growled at me. It was seriously creepy as hell, and I hope that I never see anything like it again. And I hope that whoever owns that property now never had to deal with it. So that, my friends, was a collection of more cryptid and creature stories. Stories about things that we just can't identify. Or maybe they have a really good costume. Or a really bad costume. I'm not sure how to look at that. But anyways, if you did like the video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing. And if you're already subscribed, then welcome back. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts or let me know, how have you been? It has been a minute, and I'm sorry. But I'm feeling better. I think I sound better, so hopefully we'll get back into this as a regular thing. And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic week, and until next time, take care.